The Queen's Birthday Honours 1995 were appointments by some of the 16 Commonwealth realms to various orders and honours to recognise and reward good works by citizens of those countries. The birthday honours are awarded as part of the Queen's official birthday celebrations during the month of June. The Queen's Birthday Honours were announced on the 16th of June 1995 in the United Kingdom, on the 5th of June 2009 in New Zealand, Barbados, Grenada, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, St. Lucia, Belize, Antigua and Barbuda, and Saint Christopher and Nevis. The recipients of honours are displayed as they were styled before the new honour and arranged by the country whose ministers advised the Queen on the appointments, then by honour with grades i.e. Knight, Dame Head Cross, Knight, Dame Commander etc., and then divisions i.e. Civil, Diplomatic and Military as appropriate. United Kingdom. Life Peers: Baron Sir James Blythe, Deputy Chairman and Chief Executive, The Boots Company Pic. Sir John Graham Cookney, Chairman, The Orion Publishing Group Limited. The Most Reverend Robert Henry Alexander Eames, Archbishop of Armagh and Primate of all Ireland. The Most Reverend and the Right Honourable John Stapleton Habgood, Archbishop of York. Privy Councillor Robert James Atkins, MP, Member of Parliament for South Ribble and Minister of State for the Environment and the Countryside. Department of the Environment. David John McLean, MP, Member of Parliament for Penrith and the Border and Minister of State, Home Office. Thomas Galloway, Baron Strathclyde, Government Chief Whip in the House of Lords and Captain of the Honourable Corps of the Gentlemen at Arms. Knight Bachelor Michael Bett, CBE for services to training and to personnel management. The Right Honourable Christopher John Chataway, Chairman, Civil Aviation Authority, for services to the aviation industry. Michael John Cobham, CBE Chairman, Cobham plc, for services to the defence industry. Howard Montague Colvin, CVOCBE, for services to architectural history. Julian Michael Gordon Critchley, MP, Member of Parliament for Aldershot, for political service. Anthony James Doyle, CBE, Artistic Director, Royal Ballet, for services to ballet. John Richard Grade Drummond, CBE, Director, BBC Promenade Concerts, for services to music. Professor Ian Derek Gainsford, Dean, King's College Medical and Dental School, for services to medical and dental education. Richard William George, Chairman and Managing Director, Weetabix Limited, for services to the food industry. Martin John Gilbert, CBE, for services to British history and to international affairs. Robert Norman Gunn, DL, Chairman, Further Education Funding Council for England, for services to further education. Professor John Bertrand Gurdon, FRS Fedshi. John Humphrey Plummer, Professor of Cell Biology, University of Cambridge, for services to developmental biology. Ronald Hadfield, QPM DL, Chief Constable, West Midlands, for services to the police. Terence Harrison, DL, Chief Executive, Rolls-Royce plc, for services to the engineering industry and to export. Alan Gordon Barraclough Hazelhurst, MP, Member of Parliament for Saffron Walden, for political service. Michael Holt, CBE, for political service. Peter John Hunt, Chairman and Managing Director, Land Securities plc, for services to the property industry. William Robert Patrick Knox Johnston, CBE Road *, for services to yachting. Geoffrey Lofthouse, MP, First Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, House of Commons. Professor Michael John Peckham, Director of Research and Development, Department of Health, for services to medicine. Professor Gillian Tommy Prance, FRS Director, Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, for scientific services to conservation. Cliff Richard, OBE, Entertainer, for charitable services. Derek Harry Roberts, CBEFRS Provost, University College London, for services to engineering. The Most Honourable Order of the Bath, Dame Head Cross of the Order of the Bath, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, Dame Commander of the Order of the Bath, Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, Companion of the Order of the Bath, the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George, Dame Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Dame Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Dame Head Cross of the Order of the British Empire, Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the British Empire, Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, Officer of the Order of the British Empire, Member of the Order of the British Empire, William James Murray Black, Farms and Estates Director, Scottish Agricultural College, for services to agricultural education. New Zealand, Order of New Zealand, Sir Roy Allen Mackenzie KBE, of Eastbourne, Dame Kiri Jeanette Takan RDBEAC, of Surrey, United Kingdom, Sir Miles Warren KBE, of Governors Bay, Knight Bachelor Patrick Ledger Goodman CBE, of Motueka, for services to business management, export and the community. Dr. Thomas Neil Morris Waters, of Palmerston North, for services to tertiary education. The Most Honourable Order of the Bath, Companion of the Order of the Bath Civil Division, Dr. Graham Cecil Scott, of Wellington, for public services. The Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George, Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Lieutenant General Donald Stewart McIver OBE, NZ Army, of Lower Hutt, Director, New Zealand Security Intelligence Service. The Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division, Miss Pauline Frances Engel CBE, of Auckland, for services to education. Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division, Peter James Blake OBE, of Emsworth, Hampshire, United Kingdom, for services to yachting. Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division, Mrs. Diane Jean Armstrong, of Wellington, for services to the Royal New Zealand Plunket Society. Russell Katz MBE, of Auckland, for services to yachting. Mrs. Morver Olwen Croxon, of Palmerston North, for services to arts and the community. Albert Barry Downey, of Auckland, for services to business and the community. Graham James Marsh, of Dunedin, for services to export and the community. Alexander Phillips QSM, of Taumarunui, for services to the Maori people. Mark James Todd MBE, of Moreton in Marsh, United Kingdom, for services to equestrian sport. Mrs. Beatrice Dorothy Antown JP, of Wellington, for services to the community. John Joseph Turek USM, of Auckland, for services to the Maori people. David Houghton Whale, of Wellington, for services to business management and the community. Mrs. Heather Jean White JP, of Tapeuk, for services to the community. Officer of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division, Donald Hall Binney, of Auckland, for services to art. John Kenneth Buck, of Havelock North, for services to the wine industry. James Bull, of Hunterville, for services to racing and farming. Bradley William Butterworth, of Auckland, for services to yachting. Leslie Hambleton Cleveland, of Dunedin, for services to the community. Michael Ernest Christopher Cox, of Wellington, for public services. Alistair Austin Deans, of Geraldine, for services to art. Miss Joan Marjorie Dingley, of Auckland, for services to botany. Dr. Alan Robert Edmonds, of Christchurch, for services to the wool industry. Dr. Wayne Leonard Edwards, of Palmerston North, for services to education and intercultural programs. William Clive Edwards, of Auckland, for services to the community. John Noel Keegan, of Auckland, for services to business management and the community. Dr. Hilton Legrise, of Auckland, for service to the community. David Raymond Levena, of Auckland, for services to business and the community. Professor Robert Park, of Christchurch, for services to civil engineering. Mrs. Suzanne Lena Prentice, of Invercargill, for services to music. Thomas William Schnackenberger AM, of Auckland, for services to yachting. Mrs. Robbins Coles, of Auckland, for services to the film industry. Military Division Commander Larry Robbins, Royal New Zealand Navy. Member of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Mrs. Marie Rose Orban, of Dunedin, for services to education and the community. Mrs. Marilyn Ann Bakey, of Christchurch, for services to the disabled. To Akana Charlie Carlson, of Wellington, for services to the community. Mrs. Susan Winifred Jane Dean Chatfield, of Auckland, for services to the community. Mrs. Patricia Maldwin Clapham JP, of Orewa, for services to the community. Mrs. Carol Lydia Mary Clausen JP, of Fielding, for services to local body and community affairs. Owen Francis Delaney, of Taupo, for services to sport. Miss Sandra Helen Edge, of Auckland, for services to netball. Dr. Bernard John Ford JP, of Palmerston North, for services to local body and community affairs. Mrs. Maureen Clara Fox, of Invercargill, for services to education. Colin Heber Gordage JP, of Morrinsville, for services to farming. Robert Morris Jarrett, of Pukekohe, for services to bowls. Peter Robert Knight, of Christchurch, for services to powerboat sport. Richard Trevor Vincent Linnell, of Kaiwaka, for services to the community. Raymond William Linsky, of Blenheim, for services to gliding. Mrs. Patricia Mary McQuillan, of Auckland, for services to the community. Arthur Dawson Moyer JP, of Roxburgh, for services to the community. Dr. Peter Charles Molin, of Hamilton, for services to the honey industry. Peter John Montgomery, of Auckland, for services to sports broadcasting. Alan Joseph O'Connell, of Queenstown, for services to sport and the community. George Emile Rennie, of Leiston, Canterbury, for services to farming. Alon Edgar Shaw, of Warkwill, for services to education. Mrs. Eileen Margaret Skidmore, of Te Aroha, for services to the community. Raymond Terence Watmo, Superintendent, New Zealand Police. Military Division Major Nigel John Murray, Royal New Zealand Army Medical Corps. Squadron Leader Kenneth Albert James Cunningham, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Squadron Leader Graham Warren Harris, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Service Order. Companions of the Queen's Service Order for Community Service Mrs. Elizabeth Desiree Ferguson Baxendine, of Christchurch. The Reverend John Ernest Bowles, of Lower Hutt. Colin Arthur Gilmore Wilson JP, of Taupo. Mrs. Audrey Gwen Harris, of Te Kaufata. The Reverend Kenneth Gerard Irwin, of Auckland. Archbishop Dionysios Siachas, of Wellington. The Very Reverend John Oliver Reimer, of Auckland. Mrs. Patricia Margaret Teague, of Christchurch. Companions of the Queen's Service Order for Public Services Dr. Elizabeth Ursula Ali, of Wellington. Brian Philip Najib Corbin, of Auckland. Miss Valerie Madeline Lawson, of Lower Hutt. Angus John MacDonald JP, of Naruawahia. Colin James Mackenzie, of Wellington. Lately Secretary of Labour. Mrs. Margaret Moyer JP, of Hokitika. Mrs. Gladys Joyce Ryan, of Whangarei. David Ernest Walter JP, of Stratford. Queen's Service Medal for Community Service Mrs. Sarah Taylor Priscilla Ashby JP of Takuiti, Mrs. Patricia Irene Ball of Hamilton, Robert Anthony Leighton Batley of Taihape, Mrs. June Emily Bonington of Timaru, Owen Mervyn Brooks JP of Huntley, Mrs. Doreen Elizabeth Burns of Waiheke Island, Auckland, Mrs. Hilton Ahiraka Rangi Busby of Tikipunga, Whangarei, Mrs. Alice Elizabeth Calder of Leven, Amy Euphemia Isabel Calvert of Waikanare, Mrs. Rosemary Bridget Chapman of Christchurch, Mrs. Claire Mary Emberson JP of Auckland, Mrs. Esther May Hepburn of Ashburton, Wiremu Hapihunia of Kawarau, Mrs. Joan Gertrude Johnson of Wellington, Mrs. Lorna Monica Layton of Lower Hutt, Loxley Clement Lindsay of Pines Beach, Canterbury, Mrs. Joan Mary Longcroft JP of Auckland, Noel Albert McMahon of Auckland, William James McMullen of Wellington, Brian Mahoney of Wellington, Norman John Martin of Hastings, Frederick Lewis Mitchell of Christchurch, Mrs. Phyllis Hilda Murphy of Featherston, Clarence Roland Paps JP of Takaka, Mrs. Eliza Raiha Sargent of Maketu, Mrs. Mavis Eileen Steffens of Motueka, Ellen Adrienne Lady Stewart of Christchurch, Alan George Tozer of New Plymouth, Charles Iodua of Lower Hutt, Mrs. Esther Taylor Turner of Kerry, Mrs. Dorothy Ethel Walker of Auckland, Mrs. Ellen Mary Warren of Dargaville, Mrs. Carolyn Georgina Weston of Invercargill, Mrs. Joan Elizabeth Williams of Auckland, Mrs. Leslie Iris Wills of Matamata, Mrs. Eunice Boyce Wilson of Pukekohe. Queen's Service Medal for Public Services Charles George Anderson of Wanganui, Mrs. Evelyn Annette Carrington of Whangarei, Clive Basil Cleland of Hamilton, Mrs. Helen Dashfield of Masterton, David Peter Ellery of Rotorua, Mrs. Carol Dune Garland of Christchurch, Paul Ronald Garland of Christchurch, Mrs. Catherine May Glynn of Auckland, Malcolm Campbell Grayling of New Plymouth, Mrs. Ruth Jacqueline Hira Harris JP of Rangiotu Phuket Tara Palmerston North, Marsden Alfred Heaslip of Katikati, Mrs. Lorraine Ann Hill of Russell, Wilfred Jeffs of Auckland, Ian Roy Johnson JP of Tapuke, Mrs. Diana Patricia Lenihan of Invercargill, William James McCabe of Wainuiomata, Mrs. Julia Margaret McKendry JP of Blenheim, Miss Heather Margaret MacLeod of Auckland, Ronald Kenneth McSkimming of Ranfurly, Otago, Mrs. Irene Saxon Messenger of Greymouth, John Bracken Mortimer of Hamilton, Mrs. Margaret Mortimer of Hamilton, Mrs. Catherine Jean Motion of Thames, Mrs. Miriam Harris Murray JP of Dunedin, Mrs. Glenys Patricia Sharank of Rotorua, Mrs. Helen Mary Smith JP of Porirua, Mrs. Heather Jane Tehuia of Porirua, Mrs. Christina Minuhopukia Waihape JP of Tauranga, William Grigor Walker of Clinton, Mrs. Kathleen Florence Wills JP of Timaru, Mrs. Philippa Alex Woodward of Blenheim, William James Davey, Sergeant, New Zealand Police, Ian George Duncan, Senior Constable, New Zealand Police. Queen's Fire Service Medal Walter Henry Mills, lately Deputy Chief Fire Officer, Cambridge Volunteer Fire Brigade, New Zealand Fire Service, Robert Alexander Morris, Chief Fire Officer, Te Awamutu Volunteer Fire Brigade, New Zealand Fire Service, Brian Mushamp, Chief Fire Officer, Hawera and Okayawa Fire Brigades, New Zealand Fire Service. British Empire Medal Military Division Warrant Officer Class 2 Ross Charles Fearon, Royal New Zealand Army Ordnance Corps, Sergeant Darrell Brian Lark, of the Corps of Royal New Zealand Engineers, Flight Sergeant Ronald Gregory Cox, Royal New Zealand Air Force, Flight Sergeant Calvin Paul Clare, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Police Medal John Morris Atkinson got Detective Senior Sergeant, New Zealand Police. Air Force Crosswing Commander Peter James Stockwell, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Commendation for Valuable Service in the Air Flight Lieutenant Grant Redvers Withers, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Cook Islands, British Empire Medal Civil Division Marie Reparataring for services to the community. The Honourable Ratu Taringa, for services to the community. Barbados, Grenada, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, St. Lucia, Belize, Antigua and Barbuda, Saint Christopher and Nevis.